he's one of the ones in here that's certainly familiar with fever ticks. But again, it's got to be in the environment for it to be a problem, right? So thinking through that. And, you know, one of the big differences between now and when we had screwworms before is how far do we move livestock in our production systems now? You know, so I wean a calf on Sunday evening. I mean, pre-wean those calves, and certainly don't do this, but you know, if I weaned a calf Sunday evening and sent it to the sale barn on Monday, they went through a ring on Tuesday, it would be sitting in a processing center in Central Texas and on Wednesday morning and be in Kansas or Nebraska by Thursday, right? So think about that life cycle and how far and how fast these animals move, and it's very concerning that you can move those maggots a long way in a very short period of time. And so that's a really critical thing to be thinking about when we get to the move to the response piece of this and the mitigation of this is, you know, thinking about quarantines and movement controls and things like that. So we'll get there. Last thing, kind of related to the life cycle itself, is it's important to understand how this fly is eradicated. The sterile fly technique is the proven method. Yes, it's a technology that they figured out back in the well, it was actually the early 40s, and it got delayed in development by the World War II there. But as that got over and scientists got back, that got worked up and figured out that because of the biology of this fly, you can sterilize them and you can eradicate them. The reason that works is because the female fly only mates once. Now, she may lay multiple batches of eggs, but she only mates once. And so if you saturate the environment with sterile males that mate with these natural females, it creates infertile eggs that never hatch. And so just over time, that population goes away, right? So that's why that works, and that's how that works. Certainly is critical to eradication. It's not the only thing that makes eradication effective, but it is the most important thing for eradication. So moving into some of the impacts, and certainly one of the reasons why we're worried about the reincursion of New World screwworms, not just from an animal disease or an animal welfare standpoint, but certainly from the economics involved with the situation. You think about that this pest was officially eradicated from the United States in 1966. Yeah, we had some outbreaks still in Texas up until the late 70s. Most of that was because of pressure in Mexico. They had not eradicated the fly there, and so it kept coming back into Texas and New Mexico and Arizona back during the late 70s. But since that time, certainly eradication of the New World screwworm has benefited producers and the general economy economically. So you can see some numbers there that talk about $1 billion in direct benefits to livestock producers and $3.7 billion in the general economy. And I think those numbers are a little off because they have not been adjusted for inflation, and they certainly haven't been adjusted for the market value of a lot of these livestock now. So I don't know about y'all, but cattle prices right now are not exactly like they were several years ago. So that starts making a difference. So, you know, we talked about increased costs for production or what it saves us not having screwworms. But you think about the other side of that coin, and certainly from a death loss standpoint, from a disease standpoint, or having to treat an animal infested standpoint, certainly there's some increased production losses there and costs. But you also think about the labor part of this. How many cowboys do we have riding pastures every day or every other day looking at cattle in the 40s and 50s? There's lots, right? Lots of good cowboys, lots of good horses. They had to be. We don't have that anymore. And so certainly that's going to be a significant piece of the puzzle here if we get incursion of screwworms, is the labor piece of this that it's going to take to look at those animals and get them treated if they have wounds, and do that repeatedly as necessary. And then of course that drives up the costs associated with veterinary fees, potentially with drug costs, with pesticide costs, et cetera, et cetera. So the other part of that, though, that I'm not sure that a lot of us have thought about, and I didn't think about it for a long time, is that even though this is a very treatable condition, if you get an infestation that causes a significant injury to, say you have a set of steers out there and they get a big hole and wound in the top of their loin there, what's just happened, right? So you can treat that animal, it's going to live, it's going to get over it, may not not perform as well, but we've just devalued the carcass of that animal significantly. So those costs go into that, trying to figure that out and understanding what that looks like as well. So just throw this out there just for awareness. That table there at the bottom right just is an extrapolation of what the costs were in 1976 for the outbreak here in Texas, and those numbers have just been adjusted to $2024. That does not take into account the current market value again of these animals. It does not take into account that we've got way more than 7 million head of cattle standing around now. But you can look at that and see it's a very significant impact, right? $732 million on producers and $1.8 billion to the general economy. And I know that A&M has worked up some more numbers. I don't have those right this minute, but they've got some updated numbers that are very similar to that as well to kind of show the impact. And the other part of that is how many of you have just cattle operations now on your land? Right, most of us have got some kind of hunting thing going on as well to help supplement when the cattle prices haven't been so good. How many white-tailed deer are there in the state of Texas? There's 5.3-ish million, depends on exactly what number you look at. How many white-tailed deer were there back in the 40s and 50s? Not that many, right? Depends again on who you ask, but somewhere between 250,000 to a million, depending on what year you look at, and that's the whole state. So, the hunting industry is a whitetail hunting industry is nearly a $10 billion industry just in itself every year. And then the exotic hunting piece adds another $2+ billion to that as well. So that's a very significant piece that's not counted or factored into this chart here that we need to be thinking about. And so certainly why we have our colleagues at Texas Parks and Wildlife engaged on this, because it's going to have a significant impact on wildlife, or will if it gets repeated. So not going to belabor this chart, but there's a pie graph here, but you look at the top 3 costs associated with the infestations in 1976, and it was death, loss of marketing, and labor. And that's about 72% of the costs associated with that. So, not a bad thing to be thinking about from a perspective of what might it look like moving forward if we had those. So other things that certainly factor into this as taxpayers, though, is what's it going to cost from an eradication standpoint. We don't have a sterile fly facility right now sitting in South Texas. It's going to cost somewhere between $350 and I guess it's $750 million based on what was announced on Friday, and I'll get to that too. But so that's a very significant impact. It's a very significant commitment to eradication efforts is getting that built. And certainly that money has to come from somewhere. There's money that's going to be needed for research to get better technologies or to improve the technology for sterile fly. Right now, it requires cobalt, and that gamma radiation is dangerous and hard to deal with. There's some other things out there that could be developed or further developed that will make it safer and probably faster in terms of the process. But certainly all of that takes money to get figured out and developed. The other parts that come in that you don't think about is certainly from Animal Health Commission's perspective is if we're responding to New World screwworms, what are we not doing? And certainly there will be things that we won't be doing that could have an impact as well on the livestock health and animal health. So as awareness of screwworms has increased, and certainly we've asked people, and that's one of the things that's on towards the end of this presentation is, what can you do as producers or animal owners or land managers now is monitor, do surveillance, monitor your animals. It's, I think, important to think about some of the clinical considerations, and I apologize up front, or maybe not apologize, but I'll give you fair warning that there's a few pictures in here that are a little tough. I don't have any really bad ones. We've got some really bad ones out of Mexico and Central America, but just a fair warning. But we think about what those clinical signs are and things that we need to be watching for. You see up in this dog here, that may not be an unusual presentation. There may be hundreds of these maggots inside a wound. Certainly, a wound can have a very small presentation on the surface, but have this great big pocket underneath that will just be full of these New World screwworm maggots. The other challenge to this is as these wounds grow, you'll get the secondary flies start coming in and set up along the edges. And so it's sometimes you can't, unless you're getting maggots from down deep, you'll misdiagnose something or misidentify something because we get the wrong maggots, and it's actually screwworms that are causing issues. So just mention that. So those of you who've treated screwworms, what's the number one thing that you remember about that? The odor, the smell. And everybody everywhere, I've been all over the state and a couple of different other states now, and that's what everybody says is once you ever smell that, you never forget what that is. And so part of that comes from a pheromone that the maggots produce to attract other female screwworms to come lay eggs and perpetuate that process. And some of that is just as those grow, you get secondary bacterial infections and necrosis, dead tissue in there, and all of that starts stinking as well. So certainly the foul odor. I think one of the other things I always try to point out on this discussion is these animals often will stand by themselves or separate themselves. I think from a wildlife perspective, to be thinking about what this may look like is an animal that doesn't act quite right, maybe have almost a neurologic presentation where they'll do some head shaking or act unusual. And a lot of that has to do with where they may have that infestation. So you think about the deer, and I know that we're going to hear some more about some of this, but certainly in the antler process, the shedding, the felt coming off, all of those things, those are certainly opportunities for screwworms to set up shop. But they also get up in the sinuses and ears pretty frequently on those animals and cause some head shaking and some rubbing and some things like that. So just a few pictures just to kind of demonstrate what this looks like. So here's a pony in Nicaragua. This one's a challenge because don't really know which way the screwworms were going on this one. Were they going from the outside in or from the inside out? Don't know, but that's a pretty significant, nasty looking situation there. Put up the lamb there because if you think about one of the most common places of infestation, and certainly in Central and South America where they've lived this for a long time, a requirement from a management perspective is treating every single newborn, but that umbilicus or the navel of every newborn is really susceptible to becoming infested with screwworms. And so just a kind of thought on that. Put this picture in because this is not an unusual presentation for infestation on cattle, at least cattle out on the range. What do you think may have set up this situation on this cow? Yeah, somebody said ticks. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's kind of I just put this out here because it's just an interesting historical anecdote to me, is talking to one of the tenured entomologists at A&M. He reminded me, he said, why were those fly tags developed? The ear tags that we've got now, they weren't developed for flies, they were developed for ticks back in the late 70s, because if you're controlling ticks, it's an important step to help control or prevent screwworms, because something as small as a tick bite is a big enough wound for a screwworm to set up shop in. And so that's another management piece that becomes important as we think through this, is controlling ectoparasites on our livestock and the other animals out there. So certainly our companion animals are not immune to this. A couple of cases out of Costa Rica where you have a dog that had an ear infection, and now you've got screwworms down in the we're on TV, so I can't point at it anyway. But anyway, there's screwworms down in there, and then of course, I tell everybody I was not the most wonderful anatomy student, but I do know that the dog is supposed to have more than 2 toes there, and kind of look at what's going on there, and that's infestation has caused the loss of some toes on that dog, so that's a pretty significant infestation. So again, all warm-blooded animals can certainly be victim of this. Don't spend too much time talking about this other than, in general, an infested animal is this infestation will cause death of an animal within 7 to 14 days, depending on location and depending on what gets them is the secondary bacterial infections and the sepsis. It's not the screwworms themselves that kill them, it's what comes after the screwworms are involved. So certainly need to treat these animals pretty quickly to minimize the impact of those infestations and secondary infections. And so that always brings us to a slide here on talking about treatments, and that's one of the biggest challenges that is being looked at and dealt with right now. Is currently in the United States there's only 2 approved treatments, and those are the permethrin products shown there, and those are approved because they include New World screwworms on the label. So is this permethrin any different than a whole bunch of permethrins you can get at TSC or the feed store or wherever? Not at all. But because those products don't say New World screwworm on there, legal to use them to treat New World screwworms. Same goes with the macrocyclic or the systemics, the macrocyclic lactones. We know that there are a number of those that are in use in other parts of the world in addition to some other compounds that are effective for New World screwworms, not only as a treatment, but have some preventative properties as well. But none of that is approved in the United States. Even the ones that we have approval in are for in the United States, like ivermectin, doramectin, moxidectin, that whole class of drugs. They're not labeled for use in New World screwworm. And so the only way they can be used is by a licensed veterinarian with a valid client-patient relationship to treat a screwworm infestation, and not even to use as a preventative, but as a treatment. So that's one of the things that is certainly being worked on very, very actively and very aggressively with FDA and EPA, is to get those compounds and get a list that can be put on the emergency approval short list, and be able to have those tools in our pocket. Because you start thinking about some of these systemics, what did we have in the 60s and 50s, 60s and 70s to treat screwworms with? Smear 62, yeah, that's it, yep. Maybe a little name sprinkled in there every now and then, so among some other things that work very well, but not available anymore, right? And so we need to get these other pieces, other tools in our toolbox, if you will, so that if we have to fight these screwworms, we've got some things to do that with. So one of the other things that's come up, and certainly is lots of questions about, is, well, you know, what about preventative use of things like Dectomax or doramectin or ivermectin, or putting it in feed compounds and things like that? Some of the challenges with that is certainly related to concerns over resistance. That's the biggest thing we worry about, is we want to make sure that these products are useful for not only potentially New World screwworms, but for internal parasites as well. And you think about other parasites that issues that we deal with right now. You know, we're very guarded against the consideration related to doramectin, because that's the only thing we have that prolongs cattle fever tick treatments as well, without having to, you know, that gives you a month versus having to put them in the pen and spray them every 2 weeks. And so we need to think through what that looks like and be judicious with the use on those compounds once we get them to be able to be used down the road, just so we're not creating other issues. And certainly there's concerns with resistance, not only the resistance piece, but you know, what does that do to withdrawal times and all of those things. And so those are all things that have to be worked through. Some of those are not have not been researched well either, and so we don't really know what the dosage needs to be effective in tissue. You know, there's data out there on some of these products that talk about blood levels and related to other parasites. But again, these maggots aren't eating blood, right? They're consuming tissue. When you start thinking about those compounds and the way they perform in tissue, that's a different discussion that has to be worked out and make sure we've got all that figured out. So again, we're going to get towards the end of the clinical considerations. You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You know, thinking through how do we manage and do the right things to help mitigate the risk associated with this. And certainly, I'm not going to steal all of Carl's thunder on this, but that's what we need to be thinking about, is from a management standpoint, what can we do to mitigate the risk associated with New World screwworms. And to kind of get on this slide just a little bit is one of the things that South Americans will tell you, who've lived with this for a long time, and certainly has been observed in Central America as the screwworms march northward, is that well-managed places have a lot less impact from screwworms. And so yes, is there a lot more labor involved, and is there more labor available in some of those countries? Absolutely. Is the management production system different down there? Absolutely. There's all of those pieces and parts. But the basics of thinking through, you know, looking at livestock, looking at animals, getting those that need to be treated to prevent infestations, or if there's an infestation there, getting that infestation dealt with and killing the maggots. All of that helps lower the number of screwworms in the environment. And that's what it's about, is so that you keep that population low. The lower we keep the population, the faster the sterile fly works in the environment to remove it, to complete the eradication. So with all that said, we'll kind of quit on that piece of it, and move to Euro screwworm, the current status. I'm doing okay on time? Yeah, okay. So, thinking about what's kind of happened over the last year, couple of years now, and almost 3 years, as you start looking at that timeline, you know, they started seeing an increase in cases of New World screwworms in Panama in 2022, and that really took off in 2023 as it got into Costa Rica and then up through Honduras and Nicaragua, all of Central America, until it reached southern Mexico in November of 24. And since then, of course, it's in the 7 southern states of Mexico at this point. So a lot of people ask why the expansion, what's going on there, and it's kind of a perfect storm situation. There's a combination of really the change in land use along the Darien Gap, and the Darien Gap is kind of that natural buffer between Central America and South America. They changed that land use. It was pretty forested, and they deforested that and made it a grazing area. Of course, there was a lot of demand for that grazing because a lot of the cattle in South America are finished on grass. So there was a lot of pressure to move cattle into those areas for grazing. And that was kind of going on at the same time COVID was involved, so there was illegal movements and even legal movements that probably weren't inspected adequately, and so you just ended up with infested animals in that area. And as those animals continued to move north through their production process to processing up in Central America, it just kind of moved the screwworms with it. And so that is probably the biggest issue associated with that. Certainly environmental conditions play a factor because they've been good for screwworms. So I'm not talking about climate change, I'm just talking about in general. Climate conditions have been good for that. Sterile fly strain, I mentioned that because that is monitored, and certainly folks are watching the efficacy of this sterile fly strain that's being used to make sure that it's as effective as it can be in the environment, and that was updated last August, and so they are using an updated strain right now. So where are we in Mexico? So these numbers are a little bit dated, 4,400-ish cases. That number's a couple of weeks, nearly 3 weeks old at this point. We understand the incidence rate or new case rate is somewhere between 300 and 350, maybe slightly more cases per week. We did hear last week that the infestation or the incidence rate was hovering around 12%, and it's dropped to about 8%. So maybe there's a little bit of a slowdown in the fly population in Mexico right now. I don't know why that is, but that's what's being reported by Mexico. You know, the case, the furthest north case there, it was disclosed on July the 8th in Veracruz, still remains the most northern case at this point, 370 miles from the Texas border, and 160 miles north of the current dispersal grid. And so that dispersal grid is the green area, and that's where they're dropping sterile flies to try to keep it in Mexico and not have it move any further north. You know, there's been, according to Mexico, which reported there's been no other cases other than the calf that was infested that they have found right there in northern Veracruz. Don't really know how that works. The good news, though, related to that individual infestation was Mexico did do active surveillance around that area and did put in some animal movement controls to try to figure out exactly what was going on, which is different than what they have done anywhere south of there at this point. And so they've been waiting on producers to call and say, hey, I've got screwworms before they did anything about it. They haven't been out there looking for it. So, for those of you that are involved in importation of feeding cattle, Mexican cattle, grazing Mexican cattle, you know, the port was closed. The ports were all closed again on July the 9th. And speaking to some folks at the Capitol with Secretary Rawlings in attendance on Friday, don't know that that's going to change anytime soon. And so, you know, never say never, but they are looking at Mexico to try to make sure they've got some assurances in Mexico about what's actually being done and how that's being handled before they talk about opening those ports again. So what is Mexico doing? And I think kind of the highlighted pieces there are some of the more critical pieces. You know, the only plant in the world right now that's producing sterile flies is the Copeg plant in Panama. That plant is mostly run by the USDA and has a small percentage of interest by Panama, mostly from the the labor side. That plant's capacity is 100 million flies per week. They're cranking out 110 million flies per week and have been for a number of months. Hopefully they can keep that pace up. But that's the only plant right now that's producing sterile flies. And this number I've got here that we need between 400 and 500 million sterile flies a week, I've heard is probably actually closer to 600 or 700 million sterile flies now, to get it pushed out of Mexico and back through Central America to South America. So we are a long way away from that number of flies. Mexico, or USDA did agree with Mexico to send some money down there for the conversion of a sterile fruit fly facility in Chiapas there to start producing sterile screwworm flies. Don't know when that's going to happen. They estimate July of 26, but depends on who you talk to on which side of the river as to how fast that is or isn't happening. So, but again, that's only going to be another 60 to 100 million flies per week, and that still puts us way behind. So, in terms of what USDA is doing, certainly they've been engaged with Mexico and Central America. They've got some incident management teams down there to help deal with those situations as they kind of work through that and come up north through Mexico. They are continuing to domestically work on the playbook and the response guidelines for states, and that's something that Texas Animal Health Commission has been engaged with. We have been working on that since, well, last spring, in honesty, and we have a plan, and I'll talk about this again in a minute, but we really need USDA to tell us what is going to be okay, because at the end of the day, this is a foreign animal disease, a foreign animal pest that has trade implications, and so we kind of need to all be on the same page about what's going to be allowed to protect trade, and also, more importantly, protect trade with our other states, because we can't afford to shut down all of Texas. If we have an issue in one part of Texas, we can't afford to shut down all of Texas and not be able to continue to move animals in the panhandle. So last Friday, I've mentioned this a couple of times already. Secretary Rollins, along with Governor Abbott, held a conference in the Capitol there, and Secretary Rollins announced a few things, and some of this is really, really good news. It's not going to be fast enough in lots of our opinions, but the fact that they've got it and they're moving forward is critical. So not only are with the dispersal center that's already underway, being constructed in outside Edinburgh there at Moorfield, they have committed to the $750 million to build a sterile fly plant that has the capability just to get started to produce about 300 million flies per week. And so they're also planning to build that where it's scalable, so that if they need to go up, they can, and if they need to cut back, they can do that too. And so, again, the commitment to having a domestic facility where we're not relying on a foreign country or have one that's so far away that we're going to have challenges with being really effective with those sterile flies is huge. And the fact that they've committed to $750 million instead of $350 million is another huge boon to the preparedness and certainly response efforts. In addition to that, she announced that there'd be $100 million for research, and talked about some of those things already for improving that process and coming up with other tools in the toolbox, if you will, that can be developed to deal with screwworms, not only in this country but in others as well. So the last piece of that talks about, well, a couple of other things there. Last bullet there talks about the fact that they're going to be either hiring or sending money to Mexico to hire people that are working for USDA to go along with the Mexican counterparts to kind of verify what's actually happening in all of that response. And so, again, that's an important piece that will be critical to the discussion about getting the border open back up. So, kind of touched on some of this already at the Animal Health Commission. We've been working on this for a long time. I think the important things on this slide are the fact that we've been having some communications calls with not only our state partners, our state agency partners, but certainly our industry partners as well, to keep everybody kind of on the same page about the information that's going out and preparing for, if we have an incursion, being ready to roll out additional information. And certainly as the plans get developed and finalized, having a platform in place to share that information, get everybody current, will be critical as well, which kind of brings us to the planning piece and the response plan, the three-legged stool kind of analogy there, and thinking through that. You know, to respond or deal with screwworms is kind of a three-legged stool in terms of treatment, surveillance, and movement controls and quarantine. And so treatment, certainly the biggest part of that is the sterile fly piece, but along with that goes all of the other things that producers need to do to keep that fly down in the environment, right? So doing things, management things to prevent opportunities for the fly to infest livestock and other animals, and treating those animals if they do become infested is a big part of that. So we talked about the topicals and the systemics and all of those good things, and so I'm not going to belabor that, but from a quarantine and movement restriction standpoint, that's really going to be a critical piece of this, at least until we get sterile flies that can help us get the infestations cleaned up in the environment. So, and this is a departure, right? Back in the day, there weren't any movement restrictions associated with any of this, was there? And part of that was we had sterile flies sitting in the field. We also didn't move livestock the way that we do now. So you start thinking about, and I already touched on this, start thinking about what the Texas Panhandle means to the national livestock production system. 40 to 80,000 head of dairy cattle are moving in and out of the state as day-old calves, 24-hour-old calves, and are leaving as spring and heifers to go back to the state of origin to be put in the milk stream. You start thinking about how many feed yards are up there, and what does that mean to the fed cattle industry and the beef production system in the United States. Start thinking about what does that impact for movement related to the swine industry. Same thing, moving lots of hogs in and out of the Texas Panhandle. So really, it's critical that if we have an issue in one part of the state, we're doing everything we can to limit the movement or the spread of that situation so that we can continue trade for the rest of the state. And so that's what that all gets down to, and certainly there's going to be some challenges with that. That's another reason why we need the drugs and the tools to kind of move forward with our movement and inspection and movement piece, because a part of that is going to be like fever ticks. The model is we're going to need to inspect and treat, right? And so we've got to have the tools, we've got to know what that looks like so we can get that out to producers and everybody can start thinking about what that looks like and what that means if you're in an infested area. So from a quarantine standpoint, just an update on where we are with the planning piece. We had put together an idea based on, again, the fever tick quarantine system about what Animal Health Commission would do if we had infestations. USDA has adopted and adapted that to some degree. And we're looking at essentially an infested zone, to use the terminology that's similar to fever ticks and not use terminology that can impact trade when you start talking about infectious disease, but an infectious zone and then an adjacent animal surveillance zone. And so the size of those zones is going to kind of depend on the epidemiology and the habitat and everything else, and what we find as we perform surveillance inside there. But the first infestation we find, that's kind of be the structure. We'll have an infested area, we'll have an adjacent area, and then outside of that will be a larger surveillance area. And so the movement restrictions and treatment requirements will be put on in the infested zone, and we'll just have to figure that out and get the tools and know what that looks like. So that's not necessarily the best news, but it's we're a lot further ahead now than we were 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was giving these presentations and people were asking what's that going to look like. So again, there's a lot of pieces there we've got to get figured out. The bottom line to all of that discussion, though, really comes to that highlighted portion. Here at Texas Animal Health Commission, and certainly the other state animal health officials we're working with on some groups that have the states in the Southwest and Kansas and Oklahoma, because they receive a lot of livestock, and certainly the states in the Southeast. The commitment to all of this is continuity of operations. The intent is to keep the livestock industries moving. We can't shut them down. We have to keep these industries going. Or it's not only a business issue, an economic issue, it becomes a food security issue, because animal welfare issue, because we can't, the systems just aren't set up to allow for all of these animals to stay on the place that they're born. So with all that said, the last piece is the last leg of the stool is the surveillance piece, and certainly that's a critical piece, and we'll certainly encourage everybody as they inspect their livestock and other animals to report infestations or suspicious infestations, and let us work through that with y'all. It's going to be, the reporting piece is going to be really crucial because we need to know where it is so we can adjust those zones, again, to try to contain it and mitigate the risk of moving that long distances, but certainly also so that when we do have the sterile flies, we know where to put them out. There is some active surveillance already going now along the Texas-Mexico border, and they're working on expanding that into New Mexico and Arizona, and I think even the edge of California. There are some sticky traps. We've got 101 of these traps set up on the river right now, and we're in the week 3, I believe, of either week 3, maybe week 4, time flies, in running those traps and doing active surveillance. And again, we don't think it's because there's screwworms there. It's just if that fly moves forward, we want to find it as soon as we can so we can respond to it, because our best shot is to do something with this and not have it get huge, is to find it early and deal with it in that one spot. So protocols for reporting, again, this is still at this point, we do not have screwworms in the United States. So every one of these suspicious cases and calls and investigations that we do are handled as a foreign animal disease investigation, and we have to go through that process to get the numbers and send the samples to the National Veterinary Services Laboratory for identification and confirmation. Now, we are certainly doing some identification of those flies and maggots as we get them. We have a number of entomologists we have access to, and these phones that take really good pictures now. So we have the ability to send some pictures and get some preliminary identification so that we have some assurance of what it is or isn't. And so that helps us from a response standpoint. But again, all of these ultimately have to go to National Veterinary Services Laboratory for identification and confirmation of yes or no. And so with that, we certainly encourage producers to work with their accredited veterinarians, call us directly. And 24 hours a day, we have a veterinarian on call. If you're during business hours, you want to call the region office, which is Beeville for Atascosa County, and we've got Ty Billings here, who's the region manager in Beeville. Certainly will help walk through how to get the samples and get those submitted. If you're talking to your veterinarian, same thing. Contact your county extension agent if you think you have a case and you have questions, and they'll help get us and get everybody in contact and in touch to deal with that. Same with wildlife. Call parks, call us, call somebody, and we'll get you to parks to work through that situation. So, again, to kind of sum up, we don't have screwworms, and we're not in panic mode, but we certainly are in high preparedness for mode. We need to be thinking about all of the things that we don't remember anymore or have generationally kind of forgotten about New World screwworms. We need to be monitoring our animals. We need to be doing the reporting if we see something suspicious, even if it's not. We need to be reporting so that we can find, again, if it is that one, and respond to that very quickly. The other thing to keep in mind from a surveillance standpoint, though, is if you're out in the pasture and you see something and you think it might be infested, please don't move it. Don't move it off the premises, because we don't want to spread that infestation, right? So if the animal's already moved and gets noticed somewhere, well, that's, it is what it is, and we'll deal with that. But if you're just looking at your animals and you see something that's suspicious, please don't move it off the premises. Call somebody, call your vet, call us, call extension. Again, let us work through that system to work through that. Biosecurity-wise, what are the best mitigation steps? And we'll hear some more about that moving forward. So, lastly, this is truly a community issue. This is not the cattle industry. This is not the sheep and goat industry. This is not the wildlife sector. This is not the poultry industry. This is everybody, and it's going to take everybody to include the veterinary community, the small animal practitioner dealing with the companion animal side, certainly the wildlife component, animal owners at large, and even public health is engaged at this point with us, because this can be a human issue as well. And so the last bullet I'll recognize there is, as long as there's New World screwworms in Mexico, we are living in a heightened sense of awareness, need to be living with a heightened sense of awareness, because that risk of incursion remains very high as long as it's in Mexico. And that's not that infestation in Mexico is probably there for at least a decade. And so we need to be thinking about what all of this means for all of us and our approaches on this, whether we actually end up with it or not, but being prepared with that threat, for that threat is a real consideration. So with that, we've got some additional resources on here, and I'll leave that up, but certainly glad to try to take any questions, and like I say, I got Ty here, he can answer the hard ones for me, and certainly appreciate everybody's interest and attention.
Are there any questions from our audience?
Man, must have done a good job. Better put everybody to sleep, I don't know which. All right, thank you all. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dr. Lancer. Up next, we'll have Mr. Carl Harbroth, our Extension Livestock Specialist. He will be kind of talking about some management considerations and biosecurity.
Thank you, Dale.
You're good.
Good? Okay. Judge, Farm Bureau, for inviting me. I get the good portion of this presentation. I'm not the meat and potatoes of the sandwich, even though I'm in the middle. But Dr. Lancer and I haven't sat down and counted how many times we've been on a program together talking about screw. It's obviously a hot topic. I learned a couple of weeks ago at short course I'm not a very good comedian because I had a few buzz jokes, but that didn't fly very far. So yeah, I'll try not to be too much of a comedian. Introduce myself, Carl Harbroth, Extension Livestock Specialist for South Texas. Most of you probably have met or seen my predecessor, Dr. Joe Pascals, who I replaced. My office is in Corpus. I'm actually a Guadalupe County born and raised. Left the state for school reasons and worked out state for too long. I got my family back here about 8 years ago. And I got to take the position of one of my, I would say, jobs that I've always wanted all along when Joe retired, and they opened it up and it worked out. Today, I'm going to talk a little more along the lines of just biosecurity. I'm really not going to talk about the screw worms. I think Dr. Lancer covered it as good as I've seen him cover it. He obviously did a really good job because y'all didn't ask him questions. And usually we're 20 minutes into questions after. And I think it's great that Parks and Wildlife is here too today. That's not something we've had at a lot of our meetings to talk about that component of it and what we're going to do or what we're facing there. Even though we've had experience in the keys at least of dealing with it. So when we talk about biosecurity, really biosecurity is part of a herd health plan. And Dr. Lancer tees up a lot of things that I talk about that might be strategic on my part, it might not. When we talk about this, biosecurity, when we talk about herd health plan, really, it's biosecurity, it's the nutrition of your herd, it's parasite control, it's vaccinations, it's genetics, it's minimizing stress. And all of these things are going to be really, really important, and possibly more important if we're dealing with New World screw. I mean, Dr. Lancer showed the pictures. I've seen pictures from friends and friends from Mexico where they didn't really think about it at the time, but they're in Tabasco, state of Tabasco, and they ear tagged a bunch of cows and weren't thinking about it, and ended up coming back a week later, and a bunch of cows were losing ears because of screw worms. Things like that that we don't think about really anymore. And let's be honest, Dr. Lancer was barely alive during the last outbreak. He was not alive during the last outbreak. And so what I've learned is from my parents, my grandparents, talking to a lot of people like those in the room that dealt with it. I've also done a lot of research since January on it just because I was asked to address this situation. And things are different now. You touched on it. We don't have the labor in place that we had then, the skill set to monitor and all those things that play into it. But talk about biosecurity and further that. Veterinary client-patient relationship. Dr. Lancer already touched on this. It's going to be huge. There's things that our veterinarian will have access to if we get in this situation, but we've got to have those relationships in place. And to have a really good herd health plan in place that's updated annually, you need to have that relationship. Have those questions with them. Have those discussions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You know, why is it important? Ultimately, we want to prevent disease. or any incident or spread of disease from herd to herd, because that's just gonna make us less profitable, less productive. Dale and I took a training 2 months ago, I guess end of May, on biosecurity, safe beef training. It had nothing to really do with New World Screw, or even that's become sort of a hot topic. They used foot and mouth disease as an example in that training. So, you know, we talk about movement of cattle. If we have a plan in place, and I'm using a plan, part of that plan is if something happens, and we get in a quarantine zone, which is a bad word, I know, but if you have a plan in place that can prove what you've done and what you have, and you have records, it'll help you navigate through that. At the end of the day, food safety is gonna be huge, because we're gonna end up having to do some things that we're just learning about data-wise as this gets here. And so making sure that we continue to have the safest food supply in the world, all these things are playing into it. So how does disease spread? It spreads through the air, mouth to mouth, oral contact. The cattle drink out of the same water trough. There's direct contact. There's reproductive transfer. We talk about trick or something along those lines. Just vehicles transferring things in, either carrying contaminated items or something brought in that way, or vector-borne, which is more of what we see with like the tick, fever tick, and then through the soil and fomites. So all these things are possible ways that our threats can get into our operations. These are just a short list of possible diseases that we can deal with in our operation. You know, and if we look at those, they sort of break out into categories. There's the nutrition, or the gastrointestinal, there's the respiratory, and then we can classify them into reproductive diseases. Interestingly enough, when we're working on herd health plans, and we're talking with our veterinarian about vaccination programs, and what we're doing is, depending on what part of the cycle, cattle cycle you deal with. If you're a cow-calf, you're running all of them. If you're just a stocker, or backgrounder, or something like that, you may only deal with respiratory, or maybe a little enteric disease, one or the other. If you're cow-calf, you may have to have some plan in place to deal with reproductive diseases too. Not that these diseases and respiratory can't happen to older animals, it's just less prevalent in older animals, because their immune systems have been built up. Prevention is gonna be always cheaper than trying to treat, just based on dollars. We look at vaccinations compared to what's gonna cost to treat some of these things. We always have to keep that in mind. Vaccinations are great. Vaccinations only work as well as that animal's immune system responds to it. And so, if an animal's stressed, their immune system's not full strength, they're not going to give the immune response that we would like towards that vaccine. At the end of the day, total disease protection is really not possible anymore. We can't vaccinate for everything that's out there, prevent everything that's out there, so we have to keep that in mind also. You know, with the cattle market in the status it is, it's as good as any of us have ever seen it. Hopefully it continues to grow or continues in that pattern. But a lot of us, as we break out of drought, we want to bring in replacements. We want to grow the herd. Well, what do you do with those fresh cattle? How do you handle those fresh cattle? From a biosecurity standpoint, should we monitor them, keep them quarantined, isolated from the rest of the herd for a while? Possibly. We run into BBB issues, or depending on the source, where you're getting them, those type of things. We need to work with our veterinarian, make a plan, and then have a vaccination plan in place for those cattle. It's all a part of this biosecurity. Talking to some people, and really hadn't thought about this, and we mentioned that labor's short. We don't have that cowboy crews like we used to monitor cattle. Because I mean, I know Dr. Lansford's talked about this before, and I talk about it all the time. I'm on the road all the time. You know how often I see my cows? Twice a week if I'm lucky. If we get into a situation like this, that's not gonna be enough. Someone's gonna have to be checking those cows every day, every 2 days, so if we do run into situations, we get those cattle treated fast enough. It's gonna change a lot of our ways of life. Some people do see their cows all the time. If we're running large acreage, we're gonna have to figure out how to manage that and deal with that. It's just something we haven't had to deal with. What's gonna become very important are functional gates, functional fences, functional facilities. And functional facilities is a loaded one because we don't have to go out and spend a whole lot of money on it, but we need to make sure they're working close by. We run big pastures, we might need to build some temporary things there if we're gonna have to treat cattle more often. But we also want facilities that are not gonna scratch those animals, they're not gonna get, you know, we talk about just a tick bite's enough to cause an issue. You know, we can't prevent everything, but we can do a better job. So we gotta keep all those things in mind. Nutrition, going through the 6 bullets of a herd health plan. Just making sure our cattle are in optimal body condition. What is optimal body condition? The cow in the top picture, she's about a 5. That's ideally what we'd like to see a cow out of calving. We don't want to, she doesn't be there all year, but we want her there calving because that's gonna give her the best chance to get right back. This Hereford cow on the bottom left, she's about a 4. You can see a couple of her ribs showing, she's pretty thin. She's getting about as thin as we really want them. We get below that calving, we're not gonna have as many cattle feed back. Then we have our cow on the far right, she's closer to a 6, probably closer to a 7. She's pretty healthy by all standards. Why is that important? We want our cattle to be healthy. If they're in good shape, they're not nutritionally stressed, they don't have to deal with other things that can fight off disease. They're also gonna breed back. That 5, these 3 studies, that pink line was done at Beeville, the blue line was Oklahoma, and then the red line, orangish red line, was Florida. All historical studies, classical studies done 30, 40 years ago that just looked at body condition scores with breedbacks, basically. And you can see, we always say 5, and you can see that break point on there is 5. We can get a little bit more if they're better condition, but what's it cost us to get those cows out to 6 or 7? You're talking 100 pounds. So that's why we always recommend 5. Inherent issue is, do we match up to what's available to us in our environment? We want a calf, and then she's gonna peak at lactation. And these 2 lines, the 2 color lines, the green line is just energy. The dotted green line is the amount of energy in the spring. The red is going to be protein, and then of the calorie requirement, excuse me. And so if she calves in March, which was the very far left of this, I can't point on this screen because of the TV. I guess I can point my hands. Here would be calving. This is where we peak on her protein requirements for the year. If we match that up with what's available, that probably would follow what we would see in a lot of our boards availability, right? That's not gonna work real well if we get in this screwworm situation. We're gonna need to be calving a little further out, or earlier than that, if we look at it. I'll show you something a little bit that I put together that shows that Mother Nature's not gonna be real good to us in South Texas when it comes to screwworms. Another look at nutrition and how important it is. A lot of times in mineral status, I think a lot of us live in a subclinical realm, so to speak. There's a lot of deficiencies that we have that we're not really seeing this reduction in immunity or enzyme function. We may get a few tenths less growth in some calves because we're shorting them on some mineral, but you don't see that number very easily. Or we have some group of cows, a few extra don't breed back because they're deficient in something. That's what we call subclinical. I don't get the phone call. Dale doesn't get the phone call until it's clinical. That's when it's substantial. We see it somehow, some way. But I think a lot of times we live in that middle, so we need to make sure we have a balanced, fortified mineral program in our operation. Talk a little bit about parasite control. And I made a few mistakes the first couple of times I gave this talk, talking in screwworm meat, because the flies that we deal with right now, horn flies, stable flies, horse flies, house flies, and how we treat those, try to prevent them, aren't going to work real well when it comes to screwworms. Screwworms aren't going to come hang out on the back of the cow. They're not going to hang out down low on their legs or feed down low. They're going to come in when they smell the build a new world screw room there to prevent sores, scratches, tick bites, those type of things, if we get into that situation. You know, when we talk about integrated pest management, IPMs, we can talk about IPMs in agronomy, we can talk about them in livestock. There's three components to it. There's the cultural aspect, the biological, and then the chemical. We're all pretty familiar with chemical, whether that's your porons, your tags, hospice and injectables, or boluses, wherever we want to classify as chemical. But things we can do around our operation, like clean up brown bale feeding sites, is what I call cultural. It's management. It's a fancy word, cultural, but I say management. Brown bale feeding sites are prime breeding ground for stable flies. Cleaning up excess manure pads. A biological control would be the dung beetle. Dung beetles help break up manure pads, and that way flies can't lay eggs. Another one would be, let's say, goldfish in a pond eating, or water tank eating larvae, mosquito larvae. That's another biological control. To have a successful integrated pest management system, what we're trying to do is break up the life cycle of these pests. Using all three if possible, or multiple within one, will help us be more successful. So I took the time a while back with some inspiration, because I wanted to know how much Mother Nature is going to benefit us if we get in a new world screw room situation. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, after I'm done explaining everything on this slide, it's not going to be a whole lot much more work. And Dr. Mansford already talked a little bit about the pupa, and then how when it gets cooler, we get less fly activity, they slow down, that lifespan gets longer. But at the end of the day, we're not going to get those kill-offs like we would like, and I'll explain where that's at. So the very top line, USDA puts out a couple thresholds. That yellow line is sort of the upper threshold of their happy zone, where they'll fly. They'll still function at 110 degrees, but above that, they may slow down. So we don't feel above 110 much, so that's not an issue. The blue line, straight line that is going to be the bottom temperature threshold. And in between those two, that's when we have more fly activity. And there's a prime area in the middle, but I had too many lines in there, I decided not to put it on there. The two curved lines are the average high temperature and the average low temperature for Three Rivers, Texas, by month. Now, one thing I've learned in studying this is one line that becomes very, very important if Mother Nature can be beneficial is that brown line on the bottom, and that's soil temperature. And that USDA's literature says 46, 48 degrees and we'll start killing off pupa, but it's got to be for consecutive days. 40 is the real good number. So I tried to find some really good soil data out there, and it's not on the web. There's some out there, but not by month or by day like I was really looking for. But I found a source of a probe that's been in the ground in Edroy, which is getting pretty close to the coast, so we have to take it for a grain of salt. But in the last 4.5 years, there have been 5 days where the soil temperature at 2 inches below was 46 or lower. And there was only 2 that was consecutive in the last 4.5 years. So I don't think Mother Nature is going to be much help. Now, with the slide, and the reason I put it together is to talk about colors. And for whatever reason on TV screens it doesn't work well, projectors it does. This box here and this box here are green. And for this part of the world, with fly activity reduced because of temperature, I think if we get to a situation where we deal with the world screw room, that's the windows where we're going to need to be doing these management practices. Possibly calving in November, because newborn umbilicus is prime. If you look at the list on deaths caused by New World Screw Worm, it's because of the attack of the umbilicus. But castration, dehorning, live tagging, branding, the list goes on and on. Anything where we can cause a scar or open the wound opens the door for this to be a problem. And so we may have to change our management. We may have to, as Doc said, day calf in November, it wasn't because that matched our food resources available, it's because we were trying to fight another problem. So all those are gonna play into this. When should we not calve, when should we not be born, when should we not? For sure in the red, I threw the yellow in there just because there is a fluctuation in temperature from year to year, we might get lucky and have a bigger window over there. So external parasites, Mother Nature we talked about is not really much else. For strategic treatment though, we gotta know what we're treating, when to treat it, because there are times of year that we want to treat some of these. What to use, how much to use, and at the end of the day, I always recommend to have your vet involved with this, and I really stress read the labels. So strategic use, when to treat something. There's the time of year, but then there's also the threshold, how many flies are on the end. Literature says 200 to 250 flies is when we really need to start treating our cow herd, because they're gonna start having a reduction in performance. Anybody have any idea, or wanna guess how many flies that is on a cow? This is just one side. My counterpart counted them, I did not. Any takers on any door prices?
Let's say 200.
200. 130, we got 200. So one side of the cow, 197. We had a winner. I don't know if you see me give this or not, but every once in a while someone comes up and nails it. But that's about what 200 on one side is. We assume there's more on the other side. We're above that threshold. And I like these slides because I can sit here and say, hey guys, you need to treat at 200 flies. And you're gonna look and go, well, what's 200 flies, Carl? This is roughly what it is. About a basketball. You can fill that up pretty good. You're gonna have it. Now what about this brown cow? Y'all are quiet, so we'll just go ahead and throw 92 out there. Probably should have done them in the other order, but there's less here. You know, if there's more on the other side, we're getting close to that threshold where they recommend a treatment. And so whatever treatment plan we have in place, we need to probably move forward. Great resource here put out by our entomology group. And it covers everything from flies, ticks, all the way through. If you're looking for more information, the key to this though, I think, when we start talking about the chemical side of this, is we need to really make these products and use these products in a way that's gonna give them the best efficacy that they have. Read the labels, make sure we follow the draw requirements on them. And I stress that, and you're like, why do you stress that so much? Because I almost screwed it up. If you're working cows, you're pouring them, you're preg checking, you're selling opens the next week, don't pour your opens. I'm just telling that from experience because it actually didn't happen in our operation. And I got to feed a bunch of open cows for 48 more days. Around our operation. Correct. I'll read the label. Some products have it, some products don't. That one does. The purple one doesn't. But we also need to rotate products and use other products too to keep things to be more continue to have the efficacy that we want. Just making sure dosage wise. I like to ask the question of my audience is, how many of you know weigh your cows when they're coming through? Come on, I have one. Usually I got one or two, just not to shame anybody. I don't have a scale underneath my shoe either, but what do we do if we're pouring cows? You don't have a scale. Typically, you crank it up to 1,500. You treat every one of them, right? Not everyone, but some of them other idiots. That, right or wrong, is extra label. What that does though is if there is a withdrawal, I might increase the withdrawal time. I think there was established an issue. Hopefully we're not treating cows that we're about to sell because you're wasting your money anyway, what works. So either way, probably beat that one to death. One thing I always like to point out, getting off subject a little bit, the white wormer here, you ever read the label, it's got withdrawals, but there's also precautionary statement. It says, do not administer female cattle in the first 45 days of pregnancy. I was not aware of this one until about 6-7 years ago. My suggestion on that is talk to your veterinarian and see if you need to worry about this and what you need to worry about on this precaution here. So vaccination plans, key component. A lot of people say, you know, I've got a herd health plan, I've got my vaccination plan. You know, it's a part of the herd health plan, but we talked about disease occurrence by age. what things we may be dealing with at certain times and certain functions of the counter. I've got a very generic list up here. I don't get too specific in that because I think you need to work with your veterinarian because there's some things you may deal with in this part of the world that people that I visit with, and clients I work with in the eastern side of this, my zone, don't have to do, or they deal with something you don't have to do. So keep that in mind. You know, reducing stress. And I think we've done a really good job of making sure our livestock fit the environment we're trying to raise them. And I know they're extremes. My pictures are extremes because we don't have too many highlands running around Atascosa County. But either way, that cow's not going to do very well in this environment. Having that Bossidicus influence in our environment makes it work really well. The stress that I'd like to talk about a little bit more is probably a bigger issue. Well, we deal with heat stress because we just deal with heat stress in this part of the world. I grew up down here, same as y'all. It is what it is. We do things at certain times of day. We work cows early morning, try not to do it during the heat of the day, make sure they have water and stress. The most two stressful times in an animal's life are going to be the two on the right. Calving or birth for that animal, and then weaning. And so those stressors can open the door to possible other disease, things that we want to prevent. Keeping records, taking stock. You know, I always talk about this one as the faintest pencil is stronger than the strongest mind. And I tend to think I can remember things longer than I probably do. Because every year I order supplies, we work cows, and I can't remember what we did the year before. If I kept really good records, I have that in place. I don't have to go try to find the fly tags we used last year and figure out what shape and color they were. Yeah, there's emails with invoices and things now, but you know where I'm going with this. We need to look at all of these plans annually. You know, if you're working with your veterinarian to make these plans, if he's shoulder deep trying to rearrange a calf, he's trying to help pull for you, don't ask him about your current health plan. You need to do it at a different time. Don't use cookbook internet programs. They're probably not created for your part of the world. To wrap things up, I stole this from Dr. Lansford a little bit, but good management is good health, and good health will make you look like a good manager at the end of the day. Monitoring and surveillance is going to be huge, as that was already brought, point was already made. We're going to have to find this before it becomes a problem. We have that way. And if Dr. Lansford's heard the same thing I have. Talked to those that have been successful and managed this in Central America. It's because they're good managers, not because they have a wonder drug or anything else that's getting them through it. It's management that's been the key. Work with your veterinarian, match your genetics to your environment, keep cows in the right condition. I mean, that's an argument in our household that we always have, because my 5 and my brother's 5 are two different things. And I learned that when I lived in Kansas and keep it here, because I would come home and say cows are a little thin. No, they're just fine. The reason he said that is because he was paying the feed bill and I wasn't, or he was writing the check. We were paying the feed bill together. Either way, keep good records. And remember, vaccinations are not the only component of a herd health program. Shameless plug. I don't even know if that QR code will work. There's a poster up front, but next Friday, August 29th, they're having a poster on Whitetail Deer and Wildlife Symposium. I know a couple of us are on the program. I'm not talking about musical screwworm. I'm actually talking about the difference between cattle, browsers, and grazers. So a little different topic for me, but should be a good event if you're not doing anything, if you're interested. With that, that's my contact information, and I'll open the board of questions.
Are they going to be able to get through a castration ban?
That's a good question, because banding was one of those that is an alternative to cutting, so you don't have that open wound. I still think the problem is when it falls off, if it causes a little bit of a scab, and that could leave it open. I think it's to be better than cutting, but I don't have any data that says one way or the other. You know, but that's been the alternative. I think we're gonna have to look at some bloodless, back to possibly the Burdizo, some other methods like that to do it.
What about not castrating your bull calves? I know there's, I mean, as far as the monetary
in our industry, unless we change our industry approach to that entirely, not just at our level, cap level, but 99% of males that are harvested in our country are, no, it's not 99.9, but it's high, are all castrated, all fed beef. And so, you know, is it something that you may have to do at a later date? You know, I mean, like you said, monetary, as you look at the data, 7, 8 weight bulls are gonna get discounted more than a 300 or 400 weight bull, because mainly just the stress that they go through and the risk involved with cutting them at that size. So it may get passed on to somebody else, but then we're gonna get hit with a discount at our level. You know, that's something that if those cattle go to Kansas or Nebraska, they may not be dealing with something like this. It could be an option. We're gonna have to think differently than what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing a study on the 7 weight bull calves versus steer.
I don't have data from this part of the world, but I do have some from Kansas that I can show you. I can get it to Dale. I gotta pick it up. It's there. Any other questions? Great questions. I'm mad y'all didn't ask him any questions, so. Either way, thank you all very much.
Any other questions for Dr. Harbaugh?
Those are the diesels, the way to go.
I may lean on the veterinarian in the room.
So, yeah, I certainly, from a true earned risk is gonna be less opportunity, right? None of it is 100%, but there'll be less opportunity. Now, there's some other management things and use of those that have to be factored in, as to making sure you do it and you're effective at that. The other thing that comes with that, though, is you're not removing the hormonal influence when you're using Burdizos that you are with when you do castration. So there's some trade-offs there. And that's another whole discussion. But I think the take-home message on to me is, as I think about it for my cattle down here, is do I take the hit at the market by passing on an animal if I'm living in an infested area, by passing an intact animal through the marketplace so that I don't have to deal with the potential treatment and prevention piece? Or do I deal with the treatment and prevention piece so I don't take the hit? And that's an economic question for everybody that you as an individual producer, you're going to have to work through the math on that. So those are good questions, though. Those are the right questions to be asking and kind of thinking through. What does that look like for my production system, my bottom line, my everything? How does that pencil out?
I think there's probably still some research to be done on other products that may help minimize the
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
risk
And that will make a difference. Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So, any other questions while we're getting Mr. Reedy's presentation up?
Thank y'all for staying this long on a Monday evening to learn about screwworm. I will hopefully get relatively quickly through what I want to talk to y'all about, but I'm in the green shirt with the Parks and Wildlife logo, so I'm not going to talk about cattle, I'm going to talk about wildlife. So hopefully I can get y'all some information about what we're doing as an agency and maybe some information what we might expect if this pest gets here. So what are the potential impacts to wildlife? What we do know from in the past, historical perspective, it was thought that New World screwworm had a potentially high effect on white-tailed deer, high adult mortality and very high fawn mortality. Unfortunately, in the 50s and 60s and before that, we didn't have the survey data that we have now. So as far as specifically what it did to those populations, we don't really know. But in Texas, deer hunting is a big deal, and all of y'all have stayed, so I'm guessing you probably have an interest in wildlife. It's a $4.6 billion industry, with about 750,000 deer hunters in Texas. So white-tailed deer, wildlife, hunting is a much bigger deal in our state than it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and things like that. So the impact to wildlife is very important to all of you and all of us here in Texas. The white-tailed deer population, we estimated to be about 1 million in the entire state pre-eradication of screwworm. As you can see from this, kind of our estimates, as that population definitely exploded to about 3 million, pretty soon after eradication, is now up to about 5.2, 5.3 million deer in Texas. So it's definitely assumed that the screwworm had a big impact and suppressed that population. So imagine if that pest was here now, what that would do to the white-tailed deer that we so enjoy very much. So what about the wildlife impacts? What do we know would happen to our wildlife here in Texas if we got this, this pest? Well, fortunately or unfortunately, we actually have a test case to tell us what might happen to white-tailed deer and other wildlife in Texas if we did get the pest. What is that test case? Florida Keys. In 2016, the Florida Keys actually had a screwworm outbreak. The Florida key deer is an endangered species, so very different from our deer in Texas. An endangered species of the Florida Keys. It's a highly monitored population of about 1,000 deer. No hunting, since it's an endangered species. Most of these deer are well habituated to people, and only one rode in, one rode out. So kind of a test case of an isolated population of what would happen if they got screwworm. So in October of 2016, they detected, when they detected screwworm on the island. It had an outbreak. It was October, so kind of that winter time frame. What happened? Well, here is the mortality rates of deer in the key deer in over that time frame, over that year, and you see that big jump in mortality. They lost approximately, I believe it was 135 deer during that winter in Florida. Most of those deer that died were bucks. Why did they die from screwworm if they were bucks? What are they doing during the run, right? They're fighting. I know in the spring they lose their antlers, they're getting wounds. So you have about 1,000 deer, you lost 135, so about a 13.5% mortality to that population in just that short period of time for screwworm. So can we extrapolate that to Texas? I'm not sure it'd be that simple, but that gives you an idea of what kind of mortality happened. That was no fawns, this was after fawning, so we didn't have an idea of what it would impact the fawns. That was just 90% of what were adult male deer. So imagine that if you're interested in big bucks here in South Texas. Might have an impact on what you want to do. So what do they do? First thing they did, education and outreach. They stopped unknown transport of New World screwworm, so shutting things down, not moving any animals, not moving anything, trying to keep that from being spread. Protecting pets and domestic animals on the island. They reported. If you see screwworm issues, report it, let people know. They did use a sterile insect technique. They released 188 million on that one island, sterile flies on one island to try to push back that pest. Individual animal treatment. Here's something that they did that we don't have the option of for wild deer in Texas. They obtained an emergency authorization to hand feed certain pharmaceuticals to these deer. All of these deer were literally used to people. You know what they fed them? They fed them donut holes. They would basically inject donut holes with dormectin and then hand those to the deer. They also use insecticide rollers at feeders as a topical treatment. This is an endangered species, so basically all hands on deck, gloves off, we gotta save the species. That was the attitude that they had. Not something that we can do in Texas with wild deer. So what I also want to tell you is I did meet with the Florida deer coordinator who was there during that time, this last month, and they used dormectin, they used these pharmaceuticals. They actually have no idea whether they worked. So they were just trying anything they could because they were concerned about losing that population completely. So from our perspective, is that something that we can do? Absolutely not, but it tells you what they tried to do and also gives an idea of what mortality was like just to those Florida key deer during that time. They were actually able to eradicate that the screwworm from that island, I believe in 2017, by about spring of 2017 with all the things they did, mostly that sterile insect technique. Remember, this is an island, no way in, no way out, or one way in, one way out, so they're able to affect that island very quickly. So that kind of gives us an idea of what would happen in Texas if we get this pest when it comes to white-tailed deer. So what are we doing with Parks and Wildlife? We have a 3-tiered approach. education and outreach, which is something we're doing right now, surveillance, and then if we get the pest, containment. So from an education outreach perspective, we have a communication plan. We're working very closely with Texas Animal Health Commission, USDA, all of the partners involved in this. Outreach to license holders, permit holders, and landowners. Guidance documents for the public, for hunters, things like that. Those are all being worked on. Hopefully those will be out very soon. Hopefully a bunch of y'all bought your hunting license. It came up August 15th. Hopefully we'll have a lot of those documents out before the deer season starts. And also working on some best management practices for deer breeders as well. Because talking about livestock movement, live deer movement is also an issue with screwworm. So working on that as well. We do have a web page. Just like I believe every agency also has a web page that's focused on screwworm with a lot of information for contacts, links to agency partners, specific documents, things like that. So definitely look up our web page. We have a New World Screwworm response team, jointly established with Animal Health Commission, TPWD, lots of people working on this. I think from today, I'll notice that this is very important to many agencies, and that we're all working very closely together to try to manage this situation. Early detection is the key. We are doing active surveillance. They talked about the surveillance on the border. We're also investigating roles and working with our state parks, our state natural areas to do active surveillance as well. And training biologists, game wardens, state park employees to continue surveillance for New World Screwworm. Reporting is very important. So how this is going to work? If you have livestock or domestic pets, that's when you work with Texas Animal Health Commission. If it's wildlife reporting, that's when you work with us. So if you talk to our law enforcement, you talk to our state parks, they're all going to talk to me, okay? Me, not necessarily, but every biologist in the state. So I cover Atascosa and Medina counties. So we have a biologist for every county in the state. So if you see something that you think is New World Screwworm, definitely give us a call. Call your game warden, your state park, whoever you're most comfortable with, or your local biologist. We're going to collect all that information, and then we're going to coordinate with our wildlife health team. Our wildlife health team is made up of 2 state veterinarians as well as 5 wildlife health specialists, and we'll get together with them, get that information on whether this report is important or not. Most of them probably will be, and then we'll contact you about steps to get that surveillance to determine whether that is New World Screwworm. When do you report New World Screwworm? This is something that I want to focus on a little bit here in South Texas. A live animal with open wound containing maggots. Okay, if it's a live animal, it's moving, you see a deer that has an open wound and it's walking around and you see those flies on it, absolutely give us a call. Okay? Very recently dead animal as well. A roadkill on the side of the road that's been there for 24 hours. That's probably secondary screwworm. That's probably not something that we're secondary blowflies, things like that. If you do that, there's probably, we collect samples for CWD from about 2,000 roadkills a year. There's probably 2,000 roadkills in Atascosa County. That's probably not going to work for us, but we're looking for that live animal or recently dead animal with those wounds, those maggots in it. Reach out to us, let us know. We do have a way to authorize harvested animals outside of the season. Okay, so if you see an animal that's with a wound like that walking around, that doesn't mean you pull the trigger right away. That means you give us a call, and then we can work on that authorization for you to harvest that animal for us to test it for, to pull those maggots and get them tested. During the hunting season, obviously, you can harvest an animal that looks like this, but call us, let us know. We want to be able to pull those maggots and get them checked to see if they're New World Screwworm. Because the most important thing is identifying as quickly as possible. That's really, really important. Does that make sense, everyone? I do want to talk real quick about nasal bot flies. How many people deer hunt? Raise your hand. How many people have seen a nasal bot fly come out of the nose of a deer? You don't know how many calls I get about nasal bot flies every single year. People have been hunting forever, never really looked. Nasal bot flies are not screwworms, okay? So the nasal bot fly is quite a bit more robust, kind of rounded. It doesn't have that screw appearance. So if you have something come out of the nose after you harvest a deer, it's most likely a nasal bot fly, okay? So you can call me. We'd love to visit with you about it, but probably not gonna be that, and we, unfortunately, we don't have the resources to check every single deer harvested in Atascosa County. So we wanna get to the ones that are definitely, we're most concerned about, that have those open wounds, things like that. Responses to New World Screwworm, I know TR is here, talking about what the Animal Health Commission's plan, things like that. There's most likely gonna be like animal, if we do find it, there's most likely gonna be animal movement restrictions, some zones of some kind. But if we find it quickly, we can get on that sterile fly release and do something about it. Removal of infested animals, that's also things that we'll look at if we get that pest here. We're also going to monitor wildlife populations through our regulatory surveys and potentially property-specific things. We are not talking about shutting down deer season or anything like that. That's not something that we're gonna work towards at this point. Could we look at changing bag limits and season dates? That might be on the docket, but that's years down the road. So, there's more information on disposal of or treatment of infected carcasses, incinerating or freezing, removal and treatment of all larvae from the wound, approved sprays if we can get them. But the biggest thing I want y'all to know is, one, please don't call me about every nasal lot fly, but do call me if you do see something that looks like it could be screwworm. We want to get on top of it as quickly as we can. Quick and dirty, but that was the most important part. We know it's going to affect white-tailed deer, Florida Keys, and basically one winter we had about a 13.5% loss of white-tailed deer, of a Florida key deer there. What's it going to do in Texas and to our deer populations and our other wildlife populations? We really don't know. That's the best information I have for you on what kind of effect it will have. Questions?
When running DMP pins, how's that gonna coincide with the CWD testing?
So his question was, when running DMP pens, how is that going to coincide with CWD testing? Currently, we don't have any regulations on screwworm testing of deer. So currently, it's not going to make any changes at all.
Well, the reason, we'll have the vet come in and they'll take the scraping out of the back end, the angle.
Yep.
That leaves a little sore.
Absolutely. That could be a way for a wound that a screwworm could infect. Absolutely. Any other questions? Man, y'all are a quiet crowd, for sure. Bottom line, please call us, reach out with questions. You see something, tell us, please.
Y'all as producers are potentially the first defense of such thing, you know.
Hunters, producers, managers.
So, you know, reach out to my office, reach out to Parks and Wildlife, reach out to Animal Health if you see something. I know I get pictures sent to me and I'm forwarding them on. You know, I got one on my phone about 20 minutes before we got started. So, you know, don't continue to do that. Be good stewards of our resources. That's our goal here is to continue on. I hope to stay in business, moving animals and livestock. Mr. Cood?
You know, the only thing is, you know, 10 years ago, 45 years ago, Ronald Reagan was one of my heroes. He said the 10 most feared things in America was, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. But these guys, they have it in their heart. They wouldn't be here tonight trying to educate what's happening and what's going on. We need to be concerned. We need to protect our wildlife, the cattle, families, and pets. And this is a big critical moment in our history. That some of us remember the screwworm. Some of y'all are younger that don't. But I was a kid and I remember it was bad. It was real bad. And the circumstances coming forward is something we need to prevent best we can. And we appreciate these experts for what they have and the knowledge they have. And hopefully we can, you know, get through this thing without too much loss and without too much economic impact. Hopefully you'll get through it. But lean on these fellas. They have their phone numbers. Get their cards from them. Call them. Talk to them. Tell your neighbors. I'm sure there'll be many more presentations as this thing gets closer to us. And I want to thank Dale. We've talked several times about this, trying to get it organized and get it put together. And he finally called me and said, this timing's right now. Let's get started. So we will continue. Thank you for the Farm Bureau for what they're doing and the message they're getting out. I just got back from West Texas. It's a big message out there too. So again, tell your neighbors and we'll do this again.
Thank y'all for coming and having interest. Thank Judge Cood and our our commissioners that came. I see a few of them sitting out there. Thank you for the support and letting us come and meet you at our county courtroom. Thank Atascosa County Farm Bureau for being part of the program and supplying some refreshments there. And thank y'all for coming. You know, if you have neighbors that aren't here, you know, maybe share the message that was received today. And
It's also recorded, it'll be on YouTube, you can find it on the website, so if you want to share it with your neighbor, tell somebody else also.
yeah. You know, the information can be shared. It doesn't mean that at some point in the future that there will be some updates and things that may change. Let's just kind of keep that in mind, as well as changes are made. It will be my goal, and I know Mr. Reedy and Mr. Lancer, to help get that information, you know, out to y'all as producers.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Those I will meet y'all outside and set those on the table. There was a few of y'all that came in while I was up here. I'll get y'all scanned in. I missed y'all. Your license. Thank you all.